You believe you know evil, don't you? You think you understand darkness because you've heard tales of tyrants and murderers, because you've seen men choose cruelty over kindness, because you've witnessed the small betrayals that poison ordinary lives. But I am here to tell you that everything you think you know about villainy is a child's fairy tale compared to the truth of what I am, what I've done, and why I did it. I am Xorthak the Devourer, the scourge of the northern realms, the shadow that devours light, and I have spent 8 centuries perfecting the art of evil for one purpose that would horrify you more than all my atrocities combined. I am dying now, finally dying after 800 years of orchestrated immortality. And before my essence dissolves into the cosmic void, I will tell you the one secret that no hero, no sage, no god has ever suspected. I will reveal why I became the most perfectly evil creature ever to walk beneath the stars. Why I dedicated centuries to acts of such calculated malevolence that my very name became synonymous with ultimate darkness. But first, you must understand what I was before I chose to become a monster. My birth name was Uldric Brightbane, though that identity died so completely that even I sometimes forget it ever existed. I was born in the mountain kingdom of Thalarin to a family of minor nobility, the third son of a third son, destined for nothing more significant than managing a remote castle and perhaps dying gloriously in some forgotten border skirmish. But fate had marked me for something far more extraordinary, something that would require me to abandon every trace of the man I might have been. A vision came to me on my 21st birthday, during the ceremony of choosing when young nobles traditionally declared their life's path. As I knelt before the sacred flame, waiting for divine inspiration to guide my choice between the paths of warrior, scholar, or priest, the fire suddenly blazed higher than the temple walls, and in its heart I saw not my future but the future of the world itself. What I witnessed in that prophetic flame was a vision of ending so complete, so absolute, that even now, 8 centuries later, the memory of it fills me with existential terror. I saw the great convergence, the moment when all the cosmic cycles would align, when the barriers between dimensions would grow thin as gossamer, when the ancient ones, who had slumbered since before the birth of stars, would finally wake from their eons-long dreams. These were not the familiar monsters of legend, not dragons or demons or any creature that could be fought with sword and spell. These were beings of such fundamental wrongness that their very existence was an affront to reality itself. They were the unnamed devourers, entities from the spaces between universes, things that fed not on flesh or soul, but on the very concept of existence. Where they walked, cause and effect broke down, mathematics became meaningless, and the basic laws that held reality together unraveled like poorly woven cloth. In my vision, I watched them pour through the dimensional barriers like an infection spreading through a healthy body. I saw cities not destroyed but simply ceasing to have ever existed, their absence leaving holes in memory that no one could quite explain. I witnessed entire kingdoms vanishing from history, leaving behind only the nagging sense that something important had been forgotten. I observed as the very idea of life became uncertain, as the boundary between existence and non-existence grew so blurred that people began to fade away mid-sentence, their final words hanging in the air like smoke from extinguished candles. But worse than the vision of ending was the vision of why it would happen. The Ancient Ones were not malevolent in any comprehensible sense, they were simply hungry, and reality itself was their food. They had been held at bay for eons by the cosmic barriers, vast metaphysical structures that separated our dimension from theirs. But those barriers were weakening, worn thin by the passage of time and the gradual decay of the fundamental forces that maintained them. The barriers could be repaired, reinforced, made strong enough to hold back the Ancient Ones for another cosmic age. But doing so would require a sacrifice of such magnitude that the very thought of it made my soul recoil in horror. It would require someone to become a focal point of pure evil, a being so fundamentally malevolent that their very existence would serve as a kind of cosmic lightning rod, drawing the Ancient Ones' attention and hunger away from the weakening barriers and onto themselves. This chosen sacrifice would have to embody evil so perfectly, so completely, that they would become more attractive to the Ancient Ones than the gradual consumption of reality itself. They would need to commit atrocities so vast, so precisely calculated, that their dark resonance would sing across dimensions like a siren song, and they would have to maintain this perfect evil for centuries, becoming more monstrous with each passing year, all while knowing that their damnation was the only thing standing between existence and absolute ending. The vision showed me who this sacrifice had to be. It showed me my own face, twisted by centuries of chosen corruption, my own eyes blazing with the cold fire of ultimate malevolence, It showed me the path I would have to walk, the acts I would have to commit, the man I would have to stop being in order to become the monster the world needed. But most cruelly of all, it showed me Theron Goldenheart, the son of King Aldous of the Western Marches, born on the exact same day as myself under the exact same prophetic stars. Where I was destined to become perfect evil, he was destined to become perfect good. Where I would embrace darkness, he would embody light. Where I would become the monster, he would become the hero who would eventually destroy that monster and save the world from the consequences of its own salvation. In the vision, I saw him as he would become tall and golden-headed, carrying a sword that blazed with righteous fire, leading armies of the faithful against the forces of darkness. I saw him weep over the bodies of innocents, rage against injustice, love with a purity that made the very air around him seem brighter. I saw him as everything I could never be, everything I would have to give up, everything I would spend 8 centuries learning to hate while never truly stopping loving him. But that was the cruelest joke of all to save the world. I would have to become the perfect enemy of the most perfect man who had ever lived. I would have to learn to hate what I admired, destroy what I cherished, betray what I held most sacred. I would have to become Theron's nemesis, not despite loving him, but because I loved him enough to damn myself for his sake and the sake of everything he represented. The vision faded, leaving me kneeling before the sacred flame with tears of liquid fire streaming down my cheeks. The priests assumed I was overwhelmed by divine revelation, that I had received some glorious calling to serve the light. They had no idea that I had just been shown the path to perfect damnation, that I had been chosen not to serve good but to become its ultimate antithesis. I had a choice, of course. I could have refused the vision, could have chosen to live an ordinary life and let the cosmic cycles play out as they would. But that choice would have meant watching the Ancient Ones eventually break through the weakening barriers, would have meant witnessing the slow dissolution of everything that had ever existed or ever could exist. It would have meant letting Theron face an enemy he could never defeat, because that enemy was not evil, but simply hungry, not malevolent, but merely incompatible with the very concept of existence. So I made my choice. I chose damnation over ending, chose to become a monster so that monsters would have meaning, chose to embrace evil so completely that even the Ancient Ones would find me more appealing than the abstract concept of reality itself. The transformation did not happen overnight. For the first decade, I remained Aldrich Brightbane, slowly cultivating the darkness that would eventually consume my identity entirely. I began with small cruelties, petty betrayals, minor acts of selfishness that gradually grew larger and more calculated. I learned to suppress my natural empathy, to view others as tools rather than people, to find satisfaction in suffering rather than joy in happiness. But these were just the first steps on a path that would lead me far beyond ordinary evil. To attract the attention of the Ancient Ones, I would need to become something unprecedented, a being whose very existence was a wound in the fabric of reality, whose every breath was an act of cosmic vandalism, whose presence made the universe itself recoil in horror. I began my true work in the mountain kingdom of Xorthak, a realm where ancient magics ran deep, and the barriers between dimensions were already thin. Using knowledge granted by my prophetic vision, I established myself as a minor warlord, gathering followers who were drawn to power without understanding its ultimate purpose. These early disciples thought they were serving a merely mortal tyrant, a cruel but comprehensible despot who offered them wealth and dominion in exchange for their loyalty. They had no idea that I was molding them into instruments of cosmic horror, that their gradual corruption was part of a pattern designed to create resonance across dimensional barriers. Each act of cruelty they performed in my name sent ripples through the spaces between worlds. Each innocent they tortured added another note to the siren song that would eventually draw the Ancient One's attention away from reality itself. My first great atrocity was the fall of Xorthak itself. In a single night, I orchestrated the simultaneous betrayal of every noble family in the kingdom, turning allies against each other in a carefully choreographed dance of mutual destruction. But this was not simple political maneuvering, it was dimensional engineering. The hatred, fear, and despair generated by that night of betrayal created a psychic resonance that weakened the barriers between worlds, making it easier for the Ancient Ones to sense what I was becoming. From the ashes of Xorthak, I forged my first true empire of evil. Using the survivors as my core followers, I began expanding across the mountain ranges, conquering kingdom after kingdom through methods that grew increasingly horrific with each victory. But every atrocity served a purpose. Every cruelty was calculated to create the maximum possible disruption in the cosmic order. I perfected techniques of torture that operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously, creating suffering so profound that it echoed across the barriers between worlds. I developed methods of corruption that turned heroes into villains, not through temptation but through the systematic destruction of everything they held dear. I learned to orchestrate betrayals so perfect, so precisely timed, that they created cascade failures in the very concept of trust itself. But the hardest part was not learning to commit these acts, was learning to enjoy them, to serve as an effective lure for the Ancient Ones. I could not simply perform evil deeds with noble intentions. I had to genuinely become what I was pretending to be, had to find real satisfaction in suffering, had to transform my very soul until cruelty became my natural state and mercy became impossible. This transformation was perhaps the most difficult thing any conscious being has ever attempted. I had to systematically destroy every positive aspect of my personality while amplifying every negative trait until they became defining characteristics. I had to learn to feed on pain the way others fed on joy, to find beauty in destruction the way others found it in creation, to experience love only as a prelude to the ecstasy of betrayal. The process took over a century and nearly destroyed what remained of my sanity. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I had already gone too far, if I had become so thoroughly corrupted that I would be unable to maintain the cosmic purpose that had driven me to choose this path. There were moments when I looked at the monster I was becoming and felt such revulsion that I came close to ending my existence rather than continue the transformation. But always, I remembered the vision of the Ancient Ones, remembered what would happen if I failed in my purpose. I remembered Theron, somewhere in the world, growing into the hero he was destined to become, unaware that his greatest enemy was sacrificing everything to ensure that their eventual confrontation would have meaning. I remembered that my damnation was not just personal but cosmic, that without perfect evil there could be no perfect good, that without ultimate darkness the light would have nothing to define itself against. By my second century as Xorthak the Devourer, I had achieved something unprecedented in the history of existence. I had become genuinely, thoroughly, completely evil while retaining enough awareness to understand why that evil was necessary. I had transformed myself into a being whose very presence caused reality to shudder, whose thoughts were so alien that even other monsters found me disturbing, whose existence had become a standing insult to everything decent in the universe, and it was working. Through methods that operated beyond normal perception, I could sense the Ancient Ones turning their attention toward me. Drawn by the cosmic discord I generated with every breath, their hunger, which had been slowly eroding the barriers between dimensions, began to focus on me instead. I was becoming what I had intended, a more appealing target than reality itself, a concentrated source of the wrongness they craved. But being the perfect villain required more than just committing atrocities. It required having the perfect hero to oppose me, and for that I needed Theron. Our first meeting came during my conquest of the Sunward Kingdoms, when I had already been Xorthak the Devourer for 200 years. He appeared at the Battle of Crimson Dawn, leading a coalition of forces assembled from across the known world, the first mortal army that seemed capable of challenging my expanding empire. When I saw him across that smoke-filled battlefield, my heart, or what remained of it, nearly stopped. He had become everything the vision had promised, golden-haired and righteously fierce, carrying a blade that seemed to be made of crystallized sunlight, inspiring his troops with a presence that made even my corrupted followers hesitate in their advance. But more than his appearance, it was the way he looked at me that nearly undid centuries of careful self-transformation. There was no hatred in his eyes when our gazes met, no fear or disgust or rage. There was only sorrow, infinite, compassionate sorrow for what I had become, for the darkness I had chosen, for the evil I embodied. In that moment, I realized that, on some level deeper than conscious thought, he recognized me. Not as Aldrich Brightbane, that identity was too thoroughly buried, but as someone who had once been capable of good, someone who had chosen darkness not from weakness, but from some terrible necessity he couldn't understand. The battle that followed was the first of what would become a legendary series of confrontations between ultimate good and ultimate evil. But for me, it was something far more complex, a carefully choreographed dance designed to forge Theron into the perfect weapon against cosmic horror. Every move I made was calculated not to destroy him but to teach him, not to defeat him but to strengthen him, not to corrupt him but to prove his incorruptibility. I could have killed him a dozen times during that first battle. My power at that point far exceeded his. My experience in warfare dwarfed his. My willingness to use any method gave me overwhelming advantages. But killing him would have defeated the entire purpose of my existence. Instead, I fought him to a strategic draw, gave him victories that would enhance his reputation, created scenarios that would showcase his heroism to the watching world. The pattern continued for decades. I would conquer new territories, commit fresh atrocities, threaten innocent populations, and Theron would appear with his growing band of allies to thwart my plans and save the day. But our conflicts were never as straightforward as they appeared to outside observers. Every scheme I hatched was designed to have a weakness that only someone of Theron's particular virtues could exploit. Every trap I set was meant to provide him with opportunities to display his courage, compassion, and wisdom. I was, in essence, serving as his training partner in a cosmic curriculum designed to prepare him for a battle I could never tell him was coming. Every confrontation taught him new skills. Every victory over my forces built his confidence. Every atrocity I committed and he prevented deepened his understanding of what he was fighting for. But the training had to be real. The growth had to be genuine, which meant the evil had to be authentic. I could not simply pretend to be a monster, had to become one so completely that even Theron's supernatural intuition would never suspect that I was anything other than what I appeared to be. This created a paradox that nearly destroyed what remained of my sanity. I had to genuinely attempt to corrupt him while secretly hoping he would resist. I had to truly try to defeat him while desperately wanting him to win. I had to authentically embody evil, while maintaining just enough hidden good to remember why I had chosen this path. The worst moment came during the siege of Breithold, a mountain fortress where Theron had taken refuge with several thousand refugees from my latest conquest. I had surrounded the castle with forces that outnumbered its defenders 50-1, had cut off all supply lines, had raised siege engines that could breach any wall ever built. The situation was hopeless except for the one weakness I had deliberately built into my assault plan. A small group of heroes could, theoretically, infiltrate my camp and destroy the central command structure that coordinated my siege engines. It would require incredible courage, perfect timing, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of strangers. It was, in other words, exactly the sort of mission that Theron was born to undertake. But I had made the trap too perfect, the scenario too obviously designed to draw him out. As I watched him prepare for what everyone assumed was a suicide mission, I saw doubt in his eyes for the first time. Not doubt about his ability to succeed, not doubt about the righteousness of his cause, but doubt about whether this was really a trap meant to destroy him. That doubt nearly ruined everything. If Theron began to suspect that I was anything other than purely evil, if he started to question whether my schemes were designed to be defeated, the entire cosmic balance would collapse. Perfect good could only exist in opposition to perfect evil. Any suggestion that the evil was artificial would contaminate the good by association. So I did the only thing I could do. I made the trap real. In the moment when Theron and his companions breached my command tent, instead of allowing them to destroy the siege coordination as planned, I unleashed the full fury of my accumulated power. I killed his companions, genuinely, permanently killed them, erasing even the possibility of resurrection. I shattered his legendary sword, the blade of crystallized sunlight that had never failed him. I stripped away his armor, his weapons, his magical protections, leaving him helpless before me. And then I began to torture him. Not the theatrical, ultimately harmless torture that I had used in previous encounters, but genuine agony designed to break his spirit completely. I wanted him to understand that his doubt had been correct, that I was indeed nothing more than perfect evil, that his momentary suspicion of my motives had been foolish sentimentality. I wanted to prove to him that monsters were simply monsters, that there was no hidden good in me, no secret purpose behind my cruelty. I kept him prisoner for 3 days, using methods of torment that I had perfected over centuries of practice. I showed him images of the refugees in Breithold dying of starvation, while he remained helpless to save them. I forced him to watch as I executed his surviving allies one by one, made him listen to their final words of forgiveness for his failure to protect them. I did everything in my power to break him, to prove that evil was stronger than good, to demonstrate that his heroism was nothing more than delusion in the face of cosmic reality. But Theron would not break, even as his body failed, even as his mind reeled with pain and horror, even as everything he had fought for seemed to crumble around him. He maintained his compassion when I offered him the chance to save the refugees by renouncing his beliefs and joining me. He refused. When I threatened to torture innocent children unless he abandoned his principles, he wept but held firm. When I presented him with scenarios where compromising his morals might accomplish greater good, he chose greater good through maintained virtue instead. By the end of the third day, I knew that my test had succeeded beyond my wildest hopes. Theron had proven himself incorruptible, not just in theory but in the face of ultimate temptation. More importantly, he had done so without any suspicion that the test was meant to strengthen rather than destroy him. His doubt about my nature had been eradicated by the reality of his suffering, replaced by absolute certainty that I was everything I appeared to be. I allowed him to escape, of course, made it seem like a desperate last-minute effort, a lucky break that barely succeeded against impossible odds. He returned to Brighthold just in time to organize a defense that saved the refugees and drove back my forces, becoming more legendary than ever for his triumph over seemingly certain death. But I carried the memory of those 3 days with me like a poison in my soul. I had tortured the one person in existence that I cared about, had caused genuine suffering to someone whose only crime was being born to oppose me. I had proven to myself that my transformation was complete, that I had indeed become the monster the cosmos required, that there was no line I would not cross in service of the greater purpose. The wars continued for another 2 centuries after that. Theron grew in power and wisdom, gathering around him the greatest heroes of the age, building an alliance that spanned continents and united former enemies against the threat I represented. I matched his growth with increasingly elaborate schemes, more powerful minions, deadlier weapons forged in the heart of dying stars. Our conflicts shaped the political and spiritual landscape of the entire world, inspiring songs and legends that would outlast the civilizations that created them. But beneath the surface drama of our eternal struggle, I was serving a deeper purpose. Every battle we fought weakened the barriers between dimensions just enough to let the Ancient Ones sense my presence more clearly. Every atrocity I committed sent ripples across the cosmic order that drew their attention further away from the gradual dissolution of reality. Every victory Theron won over my forces created resonances of hope and determination that would be essential weapons in the final battle to come. For I knew, as he did not, that our personal war was just the prelude to something far more significant. All of my schemes, all of his victories, all of the legends we were creating together, they were just preparation for the moment when the Ancient Ones would finally break through the weakened barriers and attempt to devour existence itself. That moment came on the night of the Great Convergence, exactly as my original vision had foretold. The stars aligned in patterns that had not been seen since the birth of the universe. Dimensional barriers grew thin as butterfly wings, and reality itself seemed to hold its breath as cosmic forces balanced on a knife's edge. I felt them coming long before they arrived at the Ancient Ones, drawn by centuries of perfectly orchestrated evil, hungry for the concentrated wrongness that I had made myself embody. They poured through the barriers like infection through a wound, beings of such fundamental alienness that the very air around them began to lose coherence. But they were not interested in gradually consuming reality anymore. I had made myself too attractive a target, had become such a perfect concentration of everything they craved, that they focused their entire attention on me. Instead of spreading across the world to devour existence piecemeal, they converged on my fortress, intent on consuming the ultimate evil that had called to them across dimensional barriers. This was the moment I had spent 8 centuries preparing for, not just my own destruction, but the salvation of everything through that destruction. The Ancient Ones would devour me completely, satisfying their cosmic hunger and returning to their slumber for another cosmic age. Reality would be preserved, the barriers would heal, and Theron would be left to rebuild a world that would never know how close it had come to absolute ending. Except that Theron, being the hero he had been forged to become, could not simply let his greatest enemy be destroyed without a fight. He arrived at my fortress just as the Ancient Ones began their feeding, leading an army of heroes, saints, and champions that represented everything good in the world. They had come to fight what they assumed was my final scheme, my ultimate bid for power, my attempt to unleash cosmic forces that would grant me dominion over all existence. They had no idea that they were interfering with a sacrifice 8 centuries in the making, that their heroic intervention was about to doom the very world they were trying to save. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the history of existence. On one side stood Theron and his forces, wielding weapons of pure light and righteousness, fighting with courage that made the stars themselves weep with admiration. On the other side writhed the Ancient Ones, beings whose very presence caused reality to buckle and warp, creatures so alien that looking at them directly could drive mortals insane. And caught between them was Xorthak, the Devourer, the perfectly evil being whose consumption was meant to satisfy, the cosmic hunger whose destruction would save everything, whose sacrifice was being prevented by the very person it was meant to protect. I tried to communicate the truth to Theron, tried to make him understand that his intervention was dooming the world, tried to explain that sometimes the greatest good required allowing evil to be destroyed, but the transformation I had undergone was too complete. When I spoke, only the voice of ultimate corruption emerged. When I acted, only perfect malevolence was possible. The hidden core of good that had motivated my 8 centuries of damnation was buried too deep for any external force to reach. So Theron fought to save me, never knowing that my salvation would mean universal damnation. His forces threw themselves against the Ancient Ones with desperate courage, trying to prevent what they assumed was my corruption by alien powers, never suspecting that my corruption was the only thing standing between existence and ending. The battle raged for 7 days and 7 nights, with reality itself serving as the battlefield. Mountains were unmade, oceans boiled away. The very concept of time became uncertain as cosmic forces clashed beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Heroes fell like autumn leaves, their life force consumed by beings that treated existence itself as food. But still, Theron fought on, driven by the unshakable conviction that no evil, however perfect, was worth the destruction of everything good. On the 7th night, as the last of his forces fell around him, and the Ancient Ones prepared for their final feast, Theron made a choice that nobody could have anticipated. Instead of trying to destroy me or save me, he chose to join me. In a moment of perfect understanding, perfect love, perfect self-sacrifice, he stepped between the Ancient Ones and myself and declared that if they wanted to consume perfect evil, they would have to consume perfect good as well. He bound his essence to mine with chains forged from pure heroism, making it impossible for the Ancient Ones to devour one without consuming the other. But perfect good and perfect evil cannot occupy the same space without creating a reaction that transcends both. When our essences merged, when ultimate light and ultimate darkness tried to exist in the same cosmic location, reality itself convulsed. The contradiction created a paradox so fundamental that it tore holes in the fabric of existence, holes that began consuming everything around them, including the Ancient Ones. For the first time in cosmic history, the devourers found themselves being devoured. The paradox created by our fusion was consuming them faster than they could consume reality, erasing them not just from existence, but from the very possibility of existence. They fought against the contradiction with all their alien power. But paradox is stronger than hunger, impossibility more absolute than entropy. As the Ancient Ones dissolved into the paradox they could not resolve, as reality began to heal from wounds that should have been permanent, I felt my consciousness merging with Theron. For the first time in 8 centuries, I was able to speak with my own voice instead of the voice of perfect corruption. For the first time since I had chosen to become a monster, I could express the love that had motivated every act of cruelty, the hope that had driven every moment of despair, the ultimate goodness that had made perfect evil possible. "Brother," I said, though he had never been my brother in blood, only in purpose. "Did you know?" "I suspected," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of uncertainty. "There were moments when I saw something else in your eyes, something that didn't match the evil you embodied. But I could never be sure, and I couldn't risk the world on suspicion. You should have let them consume me," I told him, as our merged essence began to stabilize into something that was neither good nor evil but somehow transcended both. "That was always the plan. My damnation was meant to purchase the world's salvation." "Then you understand why I couldn't," he said, and in his words I heard the same love that had driven me to choose corruption, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of what mattered most. "I would rather damn the world than let you face ending alone, rather risk everything than abandon someone who had already given up everything." The paradox that had consumed the Ancient Ones began to resolve itself as our essences found their new equilibrium. We had become something unprecedented beings who embodied both ultimate good and ultimate evil simultaneously, who existed in a state of perfect contradiction that somehow created perfect balance. The cosmic hunger that had threatened existence was satisfied not by devouring reality, but by the impossibility of our unified existence. When the final echoes of battle faded and reality settled into its new configuration, we found ourselves alone in a world that had been saved by the very contradiction that should have destroyed it. The Ancient Ones were gone, erased by paradox. The barriers between dimensions had been restored, stronger than ever, and we had become something that could never be catalogued, never be understood, never be replicated. The world believes that both Xorthak, the Devourer, and Theron, Goldenheart, died in the final battle against cosmic forces beyond comprehension. The legends speak of their mutual destruction, of how perfect good and perfect evil annihilated each other in a sacrifice that saved existence itself. They're not entirely wrong. The beings we had been did die in that moment of merger, but we continue in forms that transcend the simple categories of heroism and villainy. We are the guardians of the cosmic balance, the living embodiment of the principle that light and darkness must coexist, that good and evil must define each other, that existence itself depends on the tension between opposing forces. Sometimes we appear as separate beings. I as the wise counselor, who helps heroes understand the necessity of their struggles. He is the reformed villain who teaches that redemption is always possible. Sometimes we exist as a single entity, a figure who embodies all contradictions, who speaks with the voice of perfect wisdom precisely because we have experienced perfect folly. But always, we remember what we sacrificed to reach this point. I remember 8 centuries of chosen corruption, of becoming something monstrous in order to serve something beautiful. He remembers a lifetime of fighting against darkness while never understanding that some darkness serves the light. Together we remember that the greatest stories are not about the triumph of good over evil, but about the recognition that both are necessary parts of a larger whole. This is my confession, spoken with a voice that can finally tell truth after centuries of necessary lies. I was Xorthak the Devourer, the most perfectly evil being ever to exist, and every moment of that evil was motivated by love. I chose damnation to prevent ending, embraced corruption to preserve purity, became the monster so that heroes could have meaning, and I would do it again, in every possible world, across every conceivable timeline, for all eternity if necessary. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is to become what your beloved must hate. Sometimes the deepest good requires the appearance of perfect evil, and sometimes saving everything requires sacrificing everything you are. The ancient ones sleep now in whatever realm houses impossibilities. Satisfied by the paradox we created, no longer hungry for the destruction of existence. The barriers between dimensions are stronger than they have been since the birth of reality. The world continues, beautiful and flawed and precious, watched over by heroes who will never know how their greatest enemy became their ultimate protector. This is the truth behind all legends, the secret at the heart of every story about good triumphing over evil. Sometimes the triumph is only possible because the evil chooses to be defeated. Sometimes the victory is only meaningful because the villain makes it so. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who sacrifice their heroism for the sake of heroism itself. Remember this, when you tell the stories of champions and monsters, when you sing the songs of light overcoming darkness, when you celebrate the eternal victory of good over evil, remember that the best villains are not those who choose evil for its own sake, but those who choose to appear evil for the sake of something greater than themselves. Remember Xorthak the Devourer, who was the most perfectly evil being who ever lived, and who committed every act of that evil out of perfect love. Remember and understand that sometimes the greatest love story ever told is the one where love appears as hatred, where devotion manifests as betrayal, where the ultimate act of heroism is to become the perfect villain. This is my testament, my truth, my final gift to a world that will never understand what I sacrificed for its sake. Let it stand as proof that evil and good are not always what they appear to be, that the greatest mysteries are often the simplest truths turned inside out, that the deepest darkness sometimes serves the brightest light. I am Xorthak the Devourer, and I am Aldrich Brightbane, and I am something that transcends both names, both identities, both simple categories of moral judgment. I am the villain who was never truly villainous, the monster who was made of love, the darkness that existed only to define the light. And in being all of these contradictions simultaneously, I have become the most honest being in existence, for I am the living proof that truth is more complex than any story can contain, that love is stronger than any evil it might appear to be, that the greatest acts of goodness sometimes require the perfect performance of evil. This is my confession, my testament, my final truth. I was the villain, and I was never the villain, and both statements are equally true. Remember me as you will. The choice, as always, is yours.